All right, hey, welcome back. We're going to hit the classical age of Greece here. In chapter 6, we're going to talk mostly about Athens and the birth of democracy and the intellectual thinking of Athens. So, because of its access to silver mines and well, basically that copper mines, I believe, also. Athens is going to be the richest city state in Greece. It's also going to have more political power than most for the majority of time. Although due to its defeat at the hands of Sparta during the Peloponnesian Wars, the influence of Athens is going to wane over time. But Athens isn't necessarily known for its historically isn't celebrated for controlling large areas of Greece. It's celebrated for its thinkers. You have probably three of the greatest minds of maybe all time with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and then also its experiments in democracy. About 10% of the Athenian population could take part in the government, and that's the highest percentage of political participation in the ancient world. And so the irony, of course, of Athens during this time is the fact that, hey, it offers up, democracy to the common people, or I guess, to the very wealthy, a voice in government. But it also exploits large numbers of slaves and takes advantage of other city states during this time frame. So Pericles is the leader of Athens that ushers in this idea of democracy, right? Under Pericles, you have about 10% of the population that could vote in the public assembly, have some sort of voice in lawmaking. Now, the day-to-day lawmaking was taking place, by a council, but the larger group would get together to vote on more larger ideas. And so Pericles is the first leader to come up with this idea of paying public officials a salary. And he thought what this would do is if you paid people to work, that it would limit the likelihood that they would become corrupt, right? And it's also going to open up the possibility of poorer citizens being able to serve. Because if you don't get paid for your job as a public servant, then that's going to take the common people out of the equation of serving, because they have to make money, right? Everybody needs money to live. He also issues the laws issued during the rule of Pericles that only children of Athenian parents could be citizens of Athens, which actually kind of elevates the status of women, because all of a sudden, if you're a woman from Athens, you have a role in producing another Athenian citizen, versus if you're a woman from another city state, not so much. So you have that. And while Athens is on kind of the forefront of democracy, it's also going to be divided, and it's going to be horribly unequal. Women are going to have almost no rights. The poor are going to have very limited rights. And you have that. And so, women couldn't be citizens. They couldn't hold office. They could they could sue for divorce. But it rarely happens. And I think there's only one, the textbook talks about the fact that there's only one documented case in that situation. The very elite women, I think we talked about this, are going to be confined to their homes, while women that were further down the economic scale are at least the running shops or doing those types of things. I think we talked about here we go. Talked about that. Greek women were typically married off at a very early age to younger men, to older men. And that legal power would pass along from fathers to sons, or from fathers to husbands. And so, the father would control the woman until she was of married age. And then once she got married, then the husband would control. Typically, if a woman was widowed, her husband dies, her husband's will would tell her who she would marry, and typically that was a family member, and they would keep the wealth within the family. Talked about the right to divorce. There's very little intermixing in social settings. We've talked about this, and I think in a previous lecture. The men would hold drinking parties with other men, and they would typically have female prostitutes come in as entertainment. And so the women were separated. Prostitution's very common. You would have different levels of prostitution. So you would have like there's these heterinas that would be like the highest level of not only like companionship, but also kind of like a female buddy, and there was physical parts of that too. And then you would have, you would just have your typical lower level prostitute that would deal with the physical side of things. And so you would have a wife for creating a family, and then you would have there would be prostitutes in society to fill the role of companionship, and then to meet the physical needs of men as well. But because of this divide and the fact that men and women rarely were in similar circles, we talked about this, where bisexuality it was pretty commonplace, and this idea of homosexuality was very common in Greece. And I think we've touched on that in a previous lecture, so we'll kind of let's skip ahead, right? Slaves in Greece are treated pretty roughly. If you owned a slave, you couldn't kill them because that would be an affront to God, but you could pretty well do whatever you wanted after that. Underneath murder, okay. And so as Greece gained wealth, and as Greece gained wealth, this use of slavery would increase. And you would have huge portions of populations that would be held in slavery. Like in Sparta, 90% of the population. In Athens, we're looking at a third of the population that were held in slavery, right? Lots of different ways to end up into as slaves. Debt slavery, if you ended up owing somebody and you couldn't pay off your debt, typically, you would go into some kind of a slave situation until that debt was paid off. And then ultimately you could be sold during that time frame, and then kind of all bets are off of what's going to happen at that point. POWs, so prisoners of war. Typically, if you were taken prisoner during a war of conquest outside of Greece, you would be taken could be taken as a slave and sold. And then you have the Mediterranean slave trade that's going to exist between Egypt and Greece and Persia during this time frame. And so you're going to have lots of slaves going around. Now, the slave trade during this time frame is going to be a little bit different than like the transatlantic slave trade, or the chattel system of slavery, in which is practiced in the Western Hemisphere, North and South America. Because some slaves are going to be educated, and they're going to be used to run businesses and whatever, and some slaves are able to work their way out of slavery and repurchase their freedom. They definitely weren't it wasn't a situation where they were a piece of property that they were indebted. They had a debt to pay off, and then once that was done, they were freed. Not to say that being a slave in any situation is a positive. The worst jobs for slaves would have been like the mining. Typically, if you were a slave and you were sent to work in the mines, you're going to be worked to death, and that's going to be where your life is more than likely going to end. The important part about Greek culture that gets brought up, that's really going to be kind of the theme of the Renaissance, when we come back to this, is this idea of humanism, which is just the celebration of the fact that humans have some kind of inherent wealth, that the human experience has a value, right? And there's a shift away from these ideas of Mesopotamia or even Egypt, where this human existence is supposed to be enjoyed. It's supposed to spark creativity and intrigue. It's not just meant to be suffered, right? And so that's going to be the main idea that's going to come out of this. And so to celebrate some of these ideas, or celebrate some of the experiences of humans, the Greeks are going to develop drama, and they're gonna have plays, and they're gonna have huge festivals where they celebrate this idea. And so you're gonna have tragedies. The idea of a Greek tragedy, in which we talk about the frailty of human life, and typically the drama or the plot line is going to revolve around some kind of problem of pride. This idea of hubris, where you're more important than the gods, or you're more important than your fate, right? And so there's some circumstances that are outside of our control. And so then you would also have comedies in which the audience would basically laugh at characters that were kind of buffoons, and have some examples there that we could watch if we were in class together, but we're not going to do that here. Greek science is there. The importance of Greek science is not that it finds any revolutionary truths that hold true today, but the point is that they were looking for they were looking for explanations to natural phenomenons, like earthquakes. They're not punishment by God, but these are results of the earth floating on these gigantic oceans that sometimes slosh around, which is pretty close to the truth, because really what we're doing is we're floating around on these gigantic tectonic plates that go, right? So we have other things. Greek history is important to us, because the Greeks kind of figure out how to record history. Before this, it was kind of always about kings and conquest and whatever. But Herodotus is going to be the father of history, and he's going to document the ideas of the Greek and Persian wars. He's going to go around and do a lot of research that we would recognize today as historical research. He's going to go and he's going to read primary sources, and he's going to make judgments about those sources, and he's going to put them together, and he's going to put them together in some type of a explanation, a narrative that makes sense. And so you have that. Then you have other Greeks, Thucydides. Boy, that one just threw me for a loop right there. Thucydides is going to be he's going to write about the Peloponnesian Wars, and he's going to go out and he's going to create this idea of historical writing, in which he's going to basically make a claim that, hey, the Peloponnesian Wars happened for this reason, and then he's going to use evidence to support that idea. And that's the nuts and bolts of history today. When we look at what history is, you're making a historical claim, and then you're trying to support that by using evidence, either primary or secondary evidence, source evidence to support your claims. And so history kind of gets its birth during the classical age of Greece. Philosophy, the Greeks Greeks, I guess, invent philosophy, but they kind of are the first ones to make it a big deal. And so they start to try to look for morality or moral codes that revolve around human life. Like what is good? What is good? What is bad? What makes some people good people and some people bad people, right? And so you have those, and so these philosophers would travel from town to town, and they would tutor students that would come and learn from them, and you have those. And so your three most important Greek thinkers are going to be Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So Socrates never actually writes anything down, and his arguments would always just be oral, and Plato actually documents the majority of these later on. So There's some question on the some of the accuracy, but what comes about this is Socrates uses this Socratic method in which he asks this series of questions in which he's guiding his audience or whoever to the to his desired conclusion. And so well, we're going to break morality down, right? Break it down into its base elements and get to whatever. Plato argues that there's this universal truth that we all kind of buy into, and that's part of the human experience. And so, like, we all understand what a chair, like if I ask you to picture a chair in your mind, Plato's going to say that, hey, you know what, everybody has a picture of what a perfect chair is in their mind, and they can bring it, and these are these forms that exist outside of physical reality that all humans could tie into. And so, like, when you read the assignment for this unit, you'll deal with a little bit of Socrates. It's a work by Plato in which he's documenting a Socratic conversation, but you have the the Socratic method being displayed through deconstruction and through questions, and then this idea of forms that exist that everybody understands. And so you have that, and then ultimately you have Plato's going to form this academy in Athens that's going to teach. It's basically just going to be a school. It's going to be the predominant school of antiquity, and it's going to last until about the Middle Ages. Have that. And then you have Aristotle. Aristotle's going to come around. Aristotle's basically just going to argue that, hey, you know what, we should understand the world as fully as possible, and that we're naturally political, and we're going to work to better our situations. And so he would try to look at like human motivations and those things. Aristotle also argues for the existence of slavery, and this slavery is a natural state and those types of things. And so a lot of his ethics are cause a lot of problems. The Greek art was very high level for the time. They celebrated the human form with humanism. They would create huge sculptures made out of brass. They would have lots of celebration of the human form. The Romans are going to remanufacture a lot of the Greek art, because a lot of the over time, like the Greek statues are going to be processed down for the raw materials. And so a lot of what we have today is not actually original Greek art, but is Greek art that was reproduced by Romans. And so we have that. And we have that question there. And so that's going to get us through this part. Hopefully, I don't know if I ever do classical Greece a lot of justice, but gives you kind of a brief overview of what's going on. And we'll come back and we'll talk about Alexander the Great and the spread of Hellenism and Greek culture throughout the quote unquote known world at that point. So we'll see you then. Bye-bye.